Crap. Well, things escalated quickly, I thought, when I heard our bedroom slam shut with a deafening crash. A loud sound bounced off the walls of the deserted living room and echoed across the high ceiling. Me, Dan Dawson, and my wife Marley just got into a huge fight, so much so that the neighbors are probably sitting outside their windows with popcorn. The quarrel was furious, noisy, and painful, as always happens when two stubborn natures collide, not willing to give an inch. Verbal, hand-to-hand combat, that's how it could be described. But the evening began quite calmly. Dinner was warm, the glasses of wine were half empty, and the candles on the table were burning out. The music was playing somewhere in the background, and Marley was sitting opposite me, leaning back slightly in her chair and smiling that special smile that made me fall in love with her once. But everything went downhill when she decided to throw a bomb on me. No, not literally, of course, but that's exactly how it sounded to me. One word from her, and it was as if the fuse had been set on fire. Maybe I went too far in my reaction. Maybe I should have just taken a deep breath, counted to 10, and said nothing. But at that moment, I was like a hot coal, and every word she said only fanned the flames inside. She knows what buttons to press. She always knew. Now I stood alone in the kitchen, looking into the open refrigerator, from which the cold was blowing. The light bulb glowed brightly inside, illuminating the shelves filled with bottles, leftovers from dinner, and random items we never got around to finishing. I pulled out one of the beer bottles, ripped the cap off the edge of the table, and took a long swig. The bitter, icy taste cooled my face slightly, but my heart was still pounding and the blood was roaring in my ears. Marley was probably already sitting in the bedroom, either buried in a pillow or angrily replaying our dialogue in her head. In any case, I knew that she would not return to the living room, at least not today. I walked past the huge window that led out to the back deck. The glass reflected my silhouette, a tall, slightly stooped man with disheveled hair and a bottle in his hand. I looked exhausted. The terrace was inviting with coolness and night air, and I pushed the door to go outside. Los Angeles spread out before me like a sparkling carpet of thousands of lights. The sky was clear, without a single cloud, and somewhere far on the horizon you could see the lights of the airport. The view from here, from our hills in Studio City, was amazing. Marley fell in love with this house at first sight, and I couldn't blame her. The view was worth every penny. But damn, the price was too high. Not only in monetary terms, although insurance on this house was more expensive than our entire mortgage, but also in moral terms. This house was like a trap, gilded, luxurious, but still a trap. I remembered the day we signed the papers. At that moment, I felt as if someone had put a noose around my neck. The amount on the documents was so astronomical that I felt physically ill. At some point, I actually got up from the table, went out into the corridor, and began nervously walking back and forth. Marley followed me, her fingers gently touching my elbow, her voice soothing. "Everything will be fine, Dan," she said. "We can handle it. This is our home, our future." I believed her then. Her voice always sounded so confident. But now, standing on this terrace with a bottle of beer in my hand, I wasn't sure about it. From above, somewhere behind the wall, a muffled sound was heard. Perhaps Marley closed the bedroom window or threw something on the bed. The sound was like a soft hammer blow on my heart. "Damn," I muttered, taking another sip of beer. The city lights continued to flicker, indifferent to our little human tragedies. And I stood there, alone, trying to collect my thoughts and find a way to return the evening to the channel from which it had so hopelessly departed. Marley grew up in Ohio, near a lake just south of the Michigan border. The first years of my life were spent in the suburbs of Detroit. When I was 10, my father bought a mining company in northern Michigan, near Traverse City. I met my future wife at Michigan State University. We were both science majors. It wasn't love at first sight between Marley and me. Rather, everything developed gradually, a slow but confident flame. We were both keen, but what's more, I was even too keen on studying. I saw her 20 times in the science building cafeteria before we ever spoke, and then she was the first to speak. Marley could not be called exotically beautiful. During her student years, she was a little overweight. Not exactly fat, but I privately called it childish fatness. Although this is also not an accurate description, it was simply clear that if she took care of herself, then with age the excess weight would go away. In the end, this is what happened. I was a little confused when she approached my table. "Do you have a protractor I can borrow?" she asked without a preamble. I smiled at her, and she, with all her equanimity, answered me with a light, slightly forced smile. Silently, I reached into my backpack and took the tool out of the side pocket. "Keep it for yourself," I said, holding it out. "I have a lot of them. Not very romantic, I must admit, and not particularly clever. I was a nerd in those days, and although I became prettier in appearance with age, I remained one at heart." 2 weeks later, I saw her again. All the space on the table was littered with papers, and she herself was furiously writing something in a spiral notebook. I walked up and asked, "Maybe I should bring you some coffee." She looked at me without raising her head. "Today is not the best day," she seemed annoyed. "I have to make a report in a couple of hours." "I understand," I tried to politely respond to her refusal. "Maybe some other time then. When you have a minute of free time, can I buy you some coffee?" Marley looked up from her notes and looked at me directly, as if assessing the strange guy standing in front of her. Then she smiled widely, and I almost melted. She seemed to notice. "I'm Marley," she said bluntly. "I don't go on dates with strangers." "Sorry," I replied and was about to leave. "Wait," came her command. "If you tell me your name, you will no longer be a stranger." That's how it all started. Apart from her slightly curved curves, Marley was beautiful to me, at least. Thick red locks fell over her shoulders, and her eyes were the greenest I had ever seen. But what captivated me most was her smile. We met quite regularly throughout the next year, but we didn't particularly touch on the topic of being just the two of us. We had neither time for parties nor for relationships on the side. It took us 4 months after our first date to get intimate. We both had little experience, so we got to know our bodies and each other together. And I quite liked it. Marley was no less proactive. Marley was studying for a bachelor's degree, and I was studying for a double degree, so even though I was a year older and had studied longer, I still had at least 2 more years ahead of me. I had already received a bachelor's degree in chemistry and was now pursuing a master's degree in physics. In the spring, Marley invited me to her hometown to meet her family. They seemed nice and polite to me. I think they were a little surprised that Marley had a boyfriend. My parents were also amazed that I had met such a wonderful, beautiful woman, as my mother put it. I took Marley to see them in the summer, right before we returned to university. In the next decade, we were faced with the most serious problem, which at that time was not at all in our field of vision. If we had realized this in advance, we might have wondered whether we should continue the relationship. My father was a petrologist and very good at his job. I joked about calling him a rock scientist. To succeed in his science, one had to understand geology, mineralogy, and physico-chemical conditions. During my childhood, my father became quite famous in his community. He constantly wandered around different places, helping to identify unknown rocks or geological formations. There were no X-ray diffraction or microspectrometers at that time. We moved to the Traverse City area for a rather unusual reason. My father was fascinated by strange glowing stones unique to the small area Pisotsky. This is a petrified coral, shaped like a pebble, which glows in the dark and even looks very unusual in daylight. My father studied these stones and then founded a company that sold them all over the world. He made great money and at the same time did what he loved. I didn't see myself continuing his business, so I chose physics and chemistry. My parents were happy for me, although my father was probably a little sad. Marley majored in climate science. At first, she also had a double major, but then she decided that everything together was too difficult and dropped everything except meteorology. Even before graduation, Marley and I had heated arguments about science, or more accurately, about my science and hers. If I wanted to anger her, all I had to do was mention applied science as opposed to theoretical science. And if I really wanted to spend the night outside the bedroom, I should have compared her activities with oceanography or psychology. When she asked what it had to do with one and the other, I answered that both the oceans and the brain have been studied only 10%, and all conclusions, accordingly, are theoretical. I quickly realized that such conversations do not lead to anything good. Just because I was a pretty good scientist didn't mean I had much common sense. For our first anniversary, I took Marley north along the coast. I was going to spend the weekend in Santa Barbara, but we stopped in Ventura and had such a blast there that we decided to stay there, changing our hotel reservation. There was a county fair going on right on the beach, and we had a lot of fun. On the last evening, when we were leisurely walking along the embankment, I noticed signs the size of "no parking" signs. They said that if we don't join the movement against the climate crisis, water levels will rise all the way to here. The watermark was marked by a wavy line about 8 feet higher than where we stood. Marley saw my skeptical look. "No need," she said quietly but firmly. "We're having a great weekend. Don't spoil it." I put my arm around her shoulders, pulled her towards me, and replied, "You're right, beauty, let's just enjoy the view," and looked at the ocean and the crowd of surfers. We had a great time, but back home, a few days later, I went to the city website and saw that these signs were installed in 2009. It said the ocean would rise 8 feet by 2020, 2 years after our trip. According to the California Oceanographic Institute, water levels in Ventura have not risen even a 16th of an inch. Still, I tried to keep my mouth shut for the sake of our marriage. Marley was as fiercely dedicated to her profession as I was to mine. Some of the things she said at dinner or on the way to the mountains sometimes sounded ridiculous to me, but I tried not to show it. I loved Marley, and overall, we had a great relationship. For the first 4 years of our marriage, we had a great sex life. We got along well with each other's parents, and neither Marley nor I had brothers or sisters. In the 5th year, everything changed. First, we started talking about when to have children. Initially, we agreed, we'll settle down at work, buy a nice house. We thought 4 years would be enough, but we couldn't even imagine how housing prices would skyrocket. When the impasse arose, I was suddenly invited by an Air Force representative to participate in a project for the 6th branch of the military, the Space Force. They needed a team leader working on a new rocket booster and its fuel complex. The offer was very tempting, and I almost decided to agree, but I remembered that I needed to discuss this at home. That evening, Marley came home wild-eyed and with takeout, half an hour late. "Darling," she began excitedly, "I received an amazing offer today. The Brinks Foundation has contacted me and wants to take me on to an exclusive team of researchers led by Ronaldo Sousa." Even I knew who it was. Ron, as he was sometimes known, was of Portuguese descent and was considered one of the leading experts in the field of climate science. The Brinks Foundation is one of the leading scientific institutions in the world, but their reputation has been tarnished by their active involvement in climate protests around the globe. "Great, dear," I said sincerely. "Receiving such an offer at the beginning of your career is a rare chance." But then I remembered her current job and our plan to have children. It seems she read everything on my face. "Darling," she continued, "when I went to the boss to discuss this, it turned out that he was already in the know." "How is that?" I asked. "Ronaldo himself contacted him yesterday." She smiled radiantly. To say that she was overjoyed is an understatement. "And what does this mean for us?" I tried to ask carefully so as not to spoil her joy. "Well," she thought about it, "if I agree, we will have to postpone plans to have a child. I have not yet discussed the details with Brinks, but usually the period of work in such scientific groups is from 1 to 3 years. Despite my reluctance, it cannot be said that this was completely bad news. I decided to share my news. "I was also offered something today," I said. Marley's thoughts were already racing forward, and I had to repeat myself several times, which irritated me slightly. When the scale of what was happening finally dawned on her, she asked, "What should we do, Dan?" I don't know, I admitted honestly. Looks like it's been a crazy day for the Dawson family. Maybe we should give ourselves a couple of days to cool down so we can make an informed decision. Marley immediately made a face as if she had swallowed a jar of pickles. I'm afraid neither you nor I can afford to wait a couple of days, dear. Let's eat and discuss everything now. I'll open the wine to calm down. Over a bottle of red wine, she literally spoke out all the details of these new positions. It turned out that we would have to postpone having children. In the end, we both agreed to our appointments. I was in the sweet spot of having my day job waiting for me while I worked on a project for the Space Force. In addition, I could manage the team remotely most of the time from home, only occasionally leaving for a couple of days at Vandenberg Air Force Base near Santa Barbara. Marley had to travel to the Brinks Foundation's remote office in Long Beach, about a half hour from our home in Studio City, and it was tough during rush hour. She, like me, mostly communicates with colleagues remotely. Some of her team were in another country. We've both achieved success. I led a group of 11 talented individuals, and one that stood out was Ginny Baxter, our fuel blend expert. Ginny was a very beautiful woman, even in formal clothes. I've never seen anyone be so sexy while scribbling trigonometric formulas on a napkin. That's exactly what she did the first time I took the team to lunch off base. She and another participant were arguing about the ratios of the mixtures and the pull they could provide. 6 months later, Marley's work became even more intense. Her team was asked to study atmospheric metals and their effect on weather and soil. And then our lives were turned upside down. Marley was uncharacteristically quiet at dinner, and I sensed some big news was brewing. Finally, having finished the last piece, she spoke. The team is being sent on an expedition, she began with caution. The Foundation's management has approved a special project that changes the direction of our research. I remained silent, waiting for the continuation. We were informed about this only today, she continued, and asked to discuss it at home with our relatives. Tomorrow I have to give them an answer. I didn't like her look and this pause. And where is this excursion? I asked, trying to hide my irritation. To Antarctica, she said defiantly, and did not add anything else. You must be joking, I exploded. Even without being an expert in its field, I understood what kind of enterprise this was. No, I'm not joking, she answered quietly, evenly. We will study the ice shelf. I just stared at her, and she looked at me no less intently. I already realized then that no arguments would help me dissuade her. So this is what you want? I asked, deciding to change my tone. Yes, she said pleadingly. This is the chance of a lifetime for me. She paused and added, and we're almost out of time. The last words alarmed me. What do you mean? I asked her. Time running out? I noticed how she changed slightly. If I didn't know her so well, I would have missed this moment. We have suspended our current project. She looked a little alarmed, as if she did not want to go into details. New and very unusual changes were recorded there, and we were directed to take our own measurements and understand what they mean. And these changes, I asked dryly, are related to an extinction-level event. Please, Dan, she asked, let's not talk about this. I know how you feel about this, and talking like this won't do us any good. This is science, my science, and teamwork. How long will this expedition last? She saw that I was about to lose my temper. 4 months, she almost whispered. We were warned that in bad weather we might be delayed until 5. And this takes into account 10 days for the journey there and 10 days back. Yes, she turned away. It was clear that there was something else. There will be 9 of us if no one refuses tomorrow. 3 women and 6 men. Just 9 people going to the most inhospitable place on the planet for 5 months, I asked incredulously. This is not counting the security and evacuation teams. Her voice became even quieter. About 20 people who will be responsible for our safety while we focus on work. I had no words. My wife somehow got involved in this idea. Of course, any scientist dreams of going where only a few have gone before to study the unknown. but I was worried about the suddenness of it all. Marley, I said, I'm trying to understand you honestly. What's so important about this ice shelf? We already know that it is growing and not melting, as many claim. The most important thing is that you and I had plans for a family. But it turns out that this urgent situation is more important to you, and I again have to doubt us. My words drove her crazy. How dare you? She growled, not answering my question. Are you going to throw in these made-up stories? Okay, keep acting like a child while I try to talk about serious things. It's more like sci-fi, I snorted, and you know this very well because all the scientific journals talk about exactly this. But for the sake of our conversation, I will leave this topic. We discussed starting a family. We planned so much. And now you're being selfish. You want to go on this expedition for 5 months, but what do I do? Will I sit and twirl my fingers? Or maybe you will remain celibate for these 5 months. At least be honest with me and yourself. No, she said with conviction. You will work, mind your own business, spend more time with friends or colleagues, and wait for me to return, like any normal spouse. As far as I remember, I am not the only one involved in a special project. I would like you to be as proud of me as I am of you. After her attack, Marley seemed to lose ground. Her stern hardness suddenly softened, and she quietly sobbed. I immediately felt ashamed of my violent reaction. But she still deftly avoided the question about celibacy, which was now pounding in my head. This bothered me a lot. By and large, it doesn't matter that Marley was drawn into this large-scale project. This is really the sphere of her scientific interests. What irritated me most was my own powerlessness to change anything. From the moment we met, I was sure that my wife was engaged exclusively in science and did not give in to political games. I began to doubt whether this Ronaldo influences her too much. I said nothing and did not react in any way to her departure. Marley sighed sadly and went to bed. I didn't go to her that night. In the morning, I went for my usual jog, and when I returned, I found that she had already left. I sat down with a cup of coffee and heavy thoughts. I loved Marley, but if she continues to be so secretive and incomprehensible, I don't know what kind of future we can have. It was my day of remote work, but my colleagues immediately noticed that I was distracted. I left them to work on their own, saying that I needed to check a few formulas. Dinner that evening was painful. Marley and I mechanically picked at the food. She sent me a message only asking me to bring Chinese food, without a single warm word. It was a hard and confusing day for me, but at least I came to some conclusions. When are you leaving? My tone was harsh. Sunday afternoon, she said, pausing and exhaling. I hope we will have time to improve our relationship before I leave. The meaning of her words could be different, and this was the main problem. Before, I always understood what she meant. This time, I decided to choose the most useful interpretation for myself. This Ronaldo, I didn't take my eyes off the plate. You and him together. No, she answered too quickly. Lord, do we have to discuss this now? You must understand that there is nothing there other than professional relationships. Why do you even ask me such questions? It's important for me to know, especially after you ignored my question about celibacy yesterday. I finally looked into her eyes. You just need to know, right? Marley rolled her eyes with ostentatious dramatic effect. Everything was boiling inside me, and I took a long breath to calm my anger. So, she continued, besides the fact that you don't respect my work, my field, and my profession, now you also don't trust me. So, damn Dan, you're pissing me off already. My wife rarely went on the offensive, but now I felt that she was not alone in this war. But she just said that she wants to improve the relationship. I decided to go all in. Okay, well, I'll speak my mind to the end. I straightened up. You never acted like this until you started working at Brinks. I think if it's not your Portuguese deity, then it's someone else who managed to brainwash you. And since you're constantly evasive, I'm beginning to suspect that you'll have some kind of fun with him or even with someone else when you're not busy exploring the shelf. Damn, Marley, the more you talk, the more I worry about us. Damn it, you could work for Greta, because science is clearly not important to you right now. This means that you have either completely changed since our wedding or someone is influencing you very much. So much so that you are ready to quarrel with your husband and show him disrespect at every turn. Nothing you said is true, she shouted. I would blame you for changing, but I'm afraid you've always been like this. I just didn't notice. Oddly enough, there was not even a hint in her words that she understood my point of view. But another thought flashed in her eyes, and she suddenly changed her tone. Why do we constantly fight about this? She asked pleadingly. I thought that the longer we were together, the less often such conversations would happen. You're probably right in your assumption, Marley, I replied. But you don't take into account that the world has gone crazy. It is his madness that brings discord into our relationship, although it has nothing to do with your reluctance to answer my direct question. You say that Brinks has encountered something in Antarctica that requires your immediate intervention. Okay, I'm ready to accept it, but don't forget that your husband is also a scientist. So you and Ron and the Brinks want to save the planet. Great. Then stop ruining the soil. Do you know where carbon emissions come from, other than pollution? Yes, from everything. Stop destroying the soil with chemicals. Stop clearing away the clouds for snow for the rich. Restore the soil, and it will take care of all your carbon problems. Any practicing scientist knows this like 2 times 2, but theoretical scientists dispute everything. Why? Because this is their theoretical field in which they make money. As usual in such cases, my wife had nothing to answer. But this time I saw that she wasn't even trying to come up with something. It looks like she decided to give me an answer. Dan, she said sadly, I hope you still get your head out of your ass before I leave. And if not, then let it happen while I'm gone. I don't think I can tolerate your constant insults any longer. I noted that she again carefully sidestepped the topic of her boss. I stood up, poured half of my drink into the trash can, took the beer, and left the kitchen. Never before have I been so sure that I was losing my wife. You are still very far from the level of disrespect that I had to endure from you, dear wife. A week later, I was sitting at the kitchen table eating alone. I doubt Marley thought our little reconciliation was a bit of a getting her head out of her ass situation. Rather, we simply made a truce between ourselves, satisfying the physical need before she left. I understood that if I didn't do something productive and try to get my head out, at least in another sense, I could completely plunge into darkness in the 5 months that she would be gone. On the day of her departure, I found on my side of the shared desktop a short article, or more precisely, a declaration that she left for me. Applied science aims to find solutions to specific problems, while theoretical science seeks to understand fundamental principles and mechanisms. Examples: engineering, medicine, and environmental studies are classified as applied sciences, while theoretical physics, the study of fundamental particles, is classified as theoretical. I wonder how many feeds she flipped through to find this jewel. Someone or something was clearly influencing my wife. I could have sworn it was Ronaldo. I decided that during her trip to the ice, I would definitely find out more about him and about the Brinks. But first, there was an important step in my own work. In a week, we would have our first field tests, and the military would give us an experimental rocket booster to test. There was no time for theories anymore. If the accelerator fails, we will cost the government a pretty penny, maybe 50 million. And this morning Ginny called me aside, trying in her own way to pull me out of my dark thoughts. Well, Dan, she commanded, Coley's. I understood that I would not leave the room until I told her the whole truth, and I laid out everything as best I could. I told the whole sad story, and we both sat down on the edge of one of the study tables while she listened to me attentively. Do you have evidence that she is involved in something with Ronaldo? She asked, and this question was asked first, which puzzled me a little. No, but I have my suspicions, so I intend to dig deeper about him, I replied. Maybe it's about you. This question was more reasonable. Have you changed, or perhaps something in her work or in herself has become more irritating to you? During all this time, Ginny, I carefully analyzed our interactions and conversations. You know how inaccurate self-analysis can be, but honestly, I don't think I've done anything to set her off since she first told me about the opportunity to work with Brinks. I tried to support her because I know how important it is for her. Maybe I said or did something wrong, but definitely not enough for her to express it to me. Okay, she continued. You help me pass these tests, and I will help you deal with your problem. At first, it seemed to me that she was making an indecent proposal to me. She noticed my gaze and laughed. Strictly platonic, she added. We both laughed. The remaining week passed in emergency mode. My team did an excellent job. Often I would find Ginny in the very room where we were talking, writing out complex equations on the whiteboard that covered the entire front wall. We all worked 12 to 16 hours a day. On Friday morning, the accelerator roared to life. Launch control at Vandenberg Base began the countdown as Ginny held my hand tightly. She carefully watched for the right combination of smoke and steam as the rocket lifted off from the launch pad. We watched the car fly several thousand yards, and that was the end of it. Our rocket was not supposed to go into orbit. We only needed to prove that the fuel was capable of lifting it into the air and sending it along a given trajectory. It was all over in 2 minutes and 30 seconds. The fuel mixture worked, as did the experimental booster. On Saturday, I slept late. It's been a hell of a week. Later that day, I found a video message from Marley in my inbox. The satellites could only receive signals from the ice once every 3 days, and then it took another 36 hours to format the file, check it with security, and send it. She spoke enthusiastically about her team's work, without revealing any secrets. She was describing a colony of emperor penguins that she managed to film. Marley avoided our differences and seemed cheerful. She spoke the right words of love and encouragement. Her message left me thinking that maybe I really should stop looking inside myself. On Sunday morning, there was a knock on the door. I had just returned from a run and expected to see my neighbor or maybe my parents, but instead Ginny was standing in the doorway. Hello, Captain, she used her nickname for me. Ready to go? She noticed my sportswear and added, or am I in the way? No. I mean yes. I mean no, I muttered. She was wearing tight, straight jeans and a sexy t-shirt. I'm used to seeing her in a lab coat. Ginny was surprisingly cheerful, with a mischievous sparkle in her eyes. Why are you so inspired today? I asked, trying to change the subject. Why not? She exclaimed. We had an amazing week, didn't we? The team not only achieved its goals, but, in my opinion, exceeded them. Wait, did something go wrong? Has something happened since I saw you? No, not at all, I tried to calm her down. It's just that my other question bothers me. Ah, she thought. Then her smile returned. That's why I'm here, stupid. Let's see what we can dig up about the guys at Brinks and your mysterious Ronaldo. I made coffee, and she immediately opened her laptop. I opened mine and showed what I already had. Ginny went to the command line and smiled slyly. Okay, she stated. Let's see what the internet actually knows about them. She instantly found herself on the 4chan forums. She explained that she first needed to wade through a bunch of useless information. She tapped the keys furiously. After about 5 minutes, her smile disappeared. She started reading. You won't like this, she warned, turning the screen towards me. Someone, allegedly a former Brinks employee, has been bad-mouthing the company, alleging ties to Blackstone, the notorious corporation behind large multinational companies. The author argued that Blackstone is involved in global environmental initiatives and uses them in its supply chains while having a majority stake in Brinks. It all sounded too far-fetched. Of course, I told Ginny, this is just the delirium of an angry employee. Read on, she replied, pointing at the screen. The next paragraph mentioned the name Ronaldo Sousa. The author doubted his academic degree Doctor of Climate Physics and Sociology. It seemed to me that such a degree was impossible, which only increased my doubts about the author. The rest of the text described Sousa's difficult character, his arrogance, bullying of colleagues, and harassment of women. Blackstone allegedly covered it all up, since Ronaldo was the face of their global climate goals. If all this is even partially believable, I told Ginny, Marley got into something very dangerous. Perhaps she can't cope, and that's why she avoids answering my questions directly. That's exactly what I thought, Ginny nodded. We spent the next 2 hours scanning and reading the dark corners of the internet. Much of what I read confirmed my first impression. When it came to Brinks, science took a backseat. We decided to take a break and have dinner early. I took her to a small bistro a few blocks from my house. She had been there before. "What is your wife's specialty?" she asked when the waiter had finished taking our order. "Does she have a double degree or a main subject and an additional one?" "Her main subject is meteorology," I answered, "and the additional one is environmental engineering, although she dropped it." Ginny almost choked on her tea. She decided to change the subject. "What do you think awaits us next?" she asked. "I mean our team, now that the fuel and accelerator have proven their effectiveness." "I don't know," I answered, "but I'm sure we'll find out next week." Your mixing formula overcomes the bulkiness of huge accelerators, so I wonder what they might be planning to launch with them. Ginny and I talked well beyond dinner. She was not only pleasant in appearance, but also an amazing conversationalist. I hated that the evening had to end. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about Ginny. I thought about my wife, too. I could only hope that she hadn't fallen for Ron's tricks, but I had no way of knowing until she returned. Unfortunately, her evasiveness and his reputation heightened my suspicions. I was determined to have an open discussion with her about our marriage and our future plans. The next week flew by. Representatives of the Ministry of Defense came to the meeting with a proposal for a new project. Because of our previous success, they wanted us to develop a way to launch a 16.5 million pound payload into orbit. I looked at Ginny when they said that. It was more than twice as heavy as the Saturn V rocket, and the heaviest Apollo mission weighed about 60,000 pounds. Ginny scribbled down a few numbers on her notepad and looked at the main speaker. "We will need at least 15 boosters for such thrust, plus the fuel itself. This will add another 36,000 pounds to the total." They told us to get to work and left. We needed to expand the team. Ginny called a former colleague at Boeing, and I contacted a friend at SpaceX who already had the necessary clearances and vetted references. We are back in testing mode. I advised defense officials that we would need a second existing working accelerator to study the mechanisms and obtain accurate mass data for each component. These calculations had to be sent back to produce an additional 15 accelerators. I prepared and organized the extended team while Ginny worked on her complex formulas. Time flew by. Before I knew it, Marley had been gone for 4 months. Most nights I came home exhausted and just collapsed on my bed. I barely had time to keep the house tidy or do laundry. My sadness might have deepened, but I was too busy to dwell on it. In the first week of the 5th month, Ginny came into my office and invited me to dinner. She seemed to have something serious on her mind. "What are you going to do about your wife?" she asked directly. "I don't know what you mean, Jean," I answered honestly. "I only know one thing. If she continues her quest to put our relationship on the back burner, then I don't want to be a part of it, especially with what we know about Sousa. If she can't be honest with herself and her husband, I can't force her." Our marriage had begun to crumble long before she announced her trip, but all she cared about was my head in the sand. "I'm asking because you are the leader of this project," she clarified. "Both I and the whole team deserve to see you at your best. No distractions. Jean, we all have distractions, some more often than others. I don't plan to let anyone down or let my problems interfere with my work." Satisfied, Ginny began discussing the major issues with our payload requirements and some preliminary solutions. Every week while Marley was away, I received a satellite message from her. At first, she was excited, almost delighted with their findings, although each time she emphasized that she could not divulge anything. The project was strictly classified. In the last week before returning, Marley tried to stay cheerful, but I could see that she was exhausted, and even worse, worried and anxious. I could only look at her message and could not respond. My wife entered our house on the 158th day after leaving. I had to fly to Washington with Ginny and 3 other members of our team for a progress report. The person I hired met her with a sign and took her home with a note explaining the situation. I couldn't talk about our project since it was classified, but I told her where I was. My return flight was late in the evening. When I returned at almost 11 at night, Marley rushed to me. "Oh God," she exclaimed excitedly, "how I missed you. What were you doing in Washington? Oh yeah, you can't tell me, can you? All the last few days I have only been thinking about how I will return home to you." She jumped from topic to topic. Unable to get a word in, I just hugged her. Finally, having spoken, Marley looked at me with a familiar look and dragged me into the bedroom. The sex was desperate at first, but then she made me relax, and we were in no hurry. After the second round, Marley hugged me tightly. "Do you have to go to work tomorrow, or can you stay with me?" she asked with a pout. "I would like more than anything to stay," I replied. "I missed you terribly. But unfortunately, I need to go and brief the team on the results of today's meeting, as well as discuss minor changes to the agenda and schedule. I will do everything to get back to you as soon as possible." She seemed to accept my answer, although nothing could be changed anyway. We fell asleep, hugging each other. Marley was still sleeping when I got up to get ready. I knew that feeling very well when you finally sleep in your own bed after a long absence. I tiptoed out of the room, not wanting to wake her. When I returned home at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I was enveloped by wonderful smells wafting from the kitchen. Marley took out our best plates, lit the candles, a whole romantic atmosphere. She opened my favorite red wine to let it breathe. The dinner turned out to be interesting because Marley was eager to talk about what she saw and learned in Antarctica, but she could not. Eventually, she began to get irritated and switched to questions about the accelerator project. "Well," I admitted, "I could tell you a lot before you left. Unfortunately, during your absence, we have come so far that now I cannot tell you anything at all." I made a gesture as if I was zipping up my lips. The conversation smoothly turned to the beauties of the continent and the wildlife that she managed to observe. After dinner, we moved into the living room where she brought me a fresh glass of wine. I could feel that she was tense, and as the evening wore on, this feeling only intensified. She sat on my lap and kissed me. "Darling." I was sure that I didn't want to hear what came next. "I wish I could put this off so we could have more time to get closer again. And I know this will cause a fight, but I can't wait because of the timing." She paused, looking desperate, aware that she was about to say something painful. "I have to leave again," she blurted out. "The team goes to Manaslu." She fell silent again, studying my face. I did not expect this, even despite all the assumptions. As far as I remembered, Manaslu was located in the Himalayas, somewhere in a remote part of Nepal. "And before you ask," she added, "this is related to our recent research, or rather, it is part of it. We must install atmospheric devices. There's nothing more I can say." "I don't understand what you're doing," I said, trying to contain my anger. I just said," she interrupted me, "I cannot discuss or disclose the reasons." "If you had let me finish," I raised my voice, "I meant you personally. I don't understand you. Why are you? How many meteorologists are on your team? We were going to start a family. How long will you be gone this time? And what will happen next when you return? Are you so blinded by this that you've forgotten your obligations to me?" Marley clearly did not expect such a turn, although, as for me, she should have foreseen it. Was she so carried away that she forgot about her personal life? "No, I haven't forgotten," she finally answered with a challenge in her voice. "This is important, and you don't have to go," I finished for her. "Or she could find another capable specialist." What the hell is wrong with this Ronaldo? He didn't. She stopped short, and I clearly saw how she realized her mistake. She rushed too quickly to defend him. "He's a world-renowned climate scientist, and we're working to save the planet." I grabbed her tightly by the shoulders and gently pulled her off my lap. "It's clear. How long will you be gone this time?" I asked without emotion, although I probably didn't succeed. 4 weeks, she answered. Depending on the weather, as usual. Ron is already making arrangements with the guides to bring us to the required height. Brinks began collecting the necessary equipment even before our return from Antarctica. I didn't answer, so she continued to insist. It's just another month, Dan. It is quite possible that I would have been gone for so long before if it had not been for favorable weather. I know it's not ideal, but I'll be back before you get bored. Then we will begin our plans. I don't want to ruin this or disappoint Ron. This research is very important. I know that you understand this, just as I understand the importance of your project for the Army. The main takeaway for me was that she didn't want to disappoint her boss. I needed to get my point across very clearly. With this approach, I explained, there will always be next time. One experiment leads to another. One set of data requires the next. What happens if the results on that mountain confirm your team's worst fears? Which peak will you have to conquer next? And one more thing. Disappointing me is completely acceptable for you, but disappointing your boss is not. Yes, I also have to be up north at least once a week, but obviously I spend more time at home than away. Do you need to break up with me or get a divorce so you can feel freer and focus on your career? And remember before you answer, your husband does not believe in crisis or existential threat, and he is also a scientist. You won't have the burden of a marriage you're no longer committed to, and you'll be able to work with Ron and Brinks as much as you like. Why not face the truth and stop this farce? The conversation probably didn't go as Marley had hoped, and she still didn't respond to my direct statements. It also confirmed my belief that she was with Sousa, at least emotionally and most likely physically, in Antarctica. I left her alone with many thoughts. In the end, I once again belittled her profession. She got up and went to the back of the house, unable to hold back her sobs. I heard the bedroom door slam, and she didn't come out for a long time. It seemed to me that she was talking on the phone. I grabbed a beer and walked out onto the back deck, rethinking my life. That's where this story began. When she returned, I was watching a mindless crime show on TV. She took the remote and turned it off, sitting down opposite me. "Listen to me, Dan," she said firmly. "I don't want a divorce or a breakup. I want your respect, just as I respect you for your work, even if sometimes I don't agree with it. You know how I feel about the Army, any army. We can disagree sometimes and still love each other. This is the essence of marriage. Do you still love me or not? Well, that's all." "Marley, you know I love you," I answered immediately. "Otherwise, we wouldn't be having this conversation. You know what the problem is. Ever since you went to work at Brinks, since you met Sousa, I've become an afterthought to you. Let's put respect for science aside for a moment. I feel like I'm losing you because of your career, as if you fell in love with some idea or ideal, and I remained in the background. I'm just offering you a way out so we don't end up hating each other if your career continues to take you in the opposite direction of mine." "That's not true," she said. "Although I understand a little what you are talking about. It's important, and yes, it's important to me. Hard work, yes, but it's only 6 months in our entire lives, and there's only one left. I can't promise I'll make it up to you when I get back, but I hope you know I'll try. I still want what you want. Marley, let me ask you something because this is probably the last time we discuss our problems as marriage partners. You were and remain an intelligent, persuasive professional. You have often addressed me directly with intelligent arguments on a variety of topics, even beyond the boundaries of our professions. These arguments captured my attention even when I disagreed with them. I'm trying to understand, when did you lose it? I'm not sure I understand your question, Dan. What have I lost except your trust and respect? I saw that she really didn't understand. She wasn't just stalling for time. You dropped Antarctica on me, despite some strong arguments I made against the need for your presence there. You barely returned when you immediately announced the Himalayas, despite 5 months of separation. The wonderful woman I knew and married would have at least suggested alternatives to balance this time away from home with marriage and our promise to start a family. I don't know if Salsa has a family or if he cares about anything other than his own reputation. The woman I married would have found a way, but since you joined Brinks, she has disappeared. Do you simply agree with everything he states, including his desires for you?" Her eyes filled with tears, and I got my answer. She struggled to say something, but simply said, "I didn't do anything to be ashamed of." "When are you leaving? I'm tired of this closed conversation." She recovered, but still didn't meet my gaze. "We fly to Zurich on Monday morning, and from there on a private flight to Kathmandu." There was nothing more to talk about. I expected her to try to seduce me, but apparently our conversation had destroyed any hints of intimacy. I went to bed when she was already asleep. The next morning, I watched her as she unlocked her phone. Interestingly, she did this less often and kept it closer to her body. By the time she left to do her pre-trip shopping, I realized it wasn't difficult, probably something like zeros and sevens or eights. Later that night, I pretended to have a headache, which really put Marley in a bad mood. When I was sure she was asleep, I took her phone off the charger. The first two attempts were unsuccessful, and if the third had not worked either, the phone would have been blocked. 70707s in it worked. Marley was one of the few people who kept her mailbox neat and tidy, and I found nothing but business letters in there. The deleted items folder was also empty. Scrolling through her contacts, I didn't find any Ron. I wondered if she used another name, or worse, if she had a nickname, a love name. It turned out that it was Dr. Souza, and it almost made me feel sick. Of course, he had a PhD. "Sorry you have to put up with me for a while longer instead of pursuing your plans for the house," his message said. "It's okay," she replied. "He still acts like an ass. He better calm down before we return from the climb, otherwise there will be no planning for children." "Come on," he replied a few minutes later in the correspondence they had yesterday. At the end, he added an emoji of his head breaking into pieces. "Don't judge him harshly. You've been gone for a long time, and unlike you, his needs aren't being met, likely." "Yes," she added with a sigh emoji. "I bought you something to make you happy," he wrote. "Oh, really? Tell." "I won't tell," he teased her. They were clearly more than just lovers, which only strengthened my resolve. "Okay, it's more expensive and sexier than the lingerie I bought you for Ankh. I can't wait for you to show it to me at 8,500 feet." My feelings surprised me. Looking at the words that destroyed our marriage, I did not feel anger or pain, rather, it was confirmation of all my worst fears that my suspicions were absolutely correct. As if, in the midst of an unsuccessful match, the score on the scoreboard showed 0 o'clock. I had a lot to do, and I had to act quickly to protect myself. Lying on the couch, my mind churned like a furious sea, balancing between self-defense and revenge. My self-esteem needed a little sweet revenge. A decent plan has already begun to form in my head. Marley. Our climb didn't go the way I wanted. It didn't go the way any of us wanted, teetering on the line between annoyance and disaster. On the first day, one of the guides slipped on a snow pocket. His foot fell into the deceptively soft snow, and he twisted his ankle badly. The second guide almost fell after us, effectively canceling our ascent until a replacement was found. His recovery cost us 2 days because we could only continue at his pace, with many additional stops. On the fifth day, we took refuge from a terrible storm with strong winds that lasted almost 24 hours. All these events were probably bad omens, but not like what happened to me while we were locked in shelters during the storm. I was sure that my husband, the now aware and furious husband, was behind this. On the morning of the second day, I began to feel itching on my legs and arms. At first, I thought it was because of the new winter clothes and equipment that Brinks had purchased for us. I also noticed that the air was incredibly dry at that altitude, so Ron applied a generous amount of moisturizing lotion to my naked body that night in our tent. His touch and the slipperiness of the lotion turned me on, but we couldn't allow ourselves to complete what our bodies wanted. On the third day, the unpleasant itching spread to most of my body. I was glad that the guide was injured because it gave me the opportunity to get out of my clothes. After wetting a napkin from my backpack, I poured some hot water from our stove and carefully wiped my body. I noticed raised, red spots on the inside of my left thigh and near my left armpit. I wasn't too worried, and with the lotion soothing my skin, Ron and I that night indulged in the tender, passionate love that had been kindled by our previous reservation. The storm delayed us, and after the first hectic days, we finally had time for intimacy. Ron was a wonderful, experienced lover. Probably the taboo nature of our relationship only increased the excitement, but he knew exactly how to satisfy a woman. We became close while working, and it was predictable that sex would happen between us long before we left for Antarctica. We never discussed it, but Ronaldo was confident in himself and felt like any defense I had melted away before his onslaught. I loved Dan no matter what. I wanted him to be the father of my children when we finally decided to do it. I was in no hurry, but for some reason he insisted. I knew that if I got pregnant, I would have to leave Ron's team, so I decided to indulge in a small affair with a famous, handsome, confident man. We'll probably never see each other again. I'll still have my accomplishments of working with him and Brinks. I'll have my special secret memory of us making love in every possible way I could think of, and I'll have a loving, happy husband to spend my time with. The rest of my days. The final test was my husband's disgusting attitude towards my profession. I didn't like his sarcastic remarks, although there was some truth in some of them. I didn't dare mention our minor quarrels to Ron, as I was ashamed of my husband and his medieval beliefs. At least Ron was involved in something that really mattered, saving humanity and not developing weapons that could be launched from space. Ron complained of itching on the second and third days, but that soon went away for him. For me, no. My rashes were getting worse, and on the fourth day, Dr. Wilson, a board-certified physician who always accompanied us in case of emergencies, examined me. I was prescribed a strong calamine lotion and told that I needed to be checked daily until the rash went away. On the sixth day, the rash had spread despite treatment, and the doctor told Ron he was considering calling a helicopter to evacuate me from the mountain. When he said this, my suspicions that Dan could be the cause of all this were confirmed, and I became even more angry, taking it as another disrespect for me and my profession. Ron and I both objected to the evacuation, arguing that I was too important to the mission. I convinced the doctor that I would sign a liability waiver and that I would be fine. He told me not to use the moisturizing lotion I brought with me anymore. That day, I was also prescribed glycofulvin as an antifungal and told to document each dosage. The doctor also gave me Benadryl cream. When the condition did not improve on the eighth day, even Ron began to become seriously worried. That day, the doctor gave me amoxicillin in case of a viral infection. I felt so bad that Ron and I slept in separate sleeping bags. He sincerely sympathized with me. By the 10th day, the rash had disappeared and the team moved on. We needed to install atmospheric instruments at an altitude of 8,400 feet above sea level or higher, according to my calculations, to record the movement of metals from the upper atmosphere back to Earth. After that, when we had enough strength, Ron and I made love before bed. The nightgown he bought for me was from a famous manufacturer in southern France. I was pleased to put it on and take it off in preparation for intimacy, since our nights had been quite wild. Unfortunately, thoughts about Dan started to come back to me. Before leaving, he behaved completely out of character. He refused sex both nights before I left, and this had never happened before. He was unreasonably sarcastic and even rude about my work and how it was taking up our time without caring about my feelings. It wasn't like him. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Dan always made snide remarks about climate research. When he went too far and made me angry, he usually backed down and apologized. But recently such comments have become more frequent. His endless whining about me and Ron made me wonder if he knew something. How could he know? Was he just pointing his finger at the sky? Maybe he's having an affair, I thought. Maybe a new woman or girlfriend is influencing him. He mentioned someone. A new woman who, according to him, was smart and a first-class specialist. I tried to get these thoughts out of my head. After the third snowstorm, the second of which seemed to come out of nowhere, the entire team was on edge, especially Ron. Every time he had a signal, he spoke on the Satcom ICOM Ike, with whom unknown. This told me that the mission was on the verge of failure. We stayed at altitude a week longer than planned, and I felt the anxiety of the doctor and the guide. It was day 27, and we still needed to get to 8,500 feet, set up our instruments, and get down the mountain safely. That night, in our hideout, I decided to talk to Ron. "Who were you talking to, honey?" I tried to start softly, but immediately realized that a seductive tone would not work. Ron was tense as a string. "Tomorrow we will install the atmospheric devices, Marley," he announced. "But we're not even close to the target altitude," I reminded him. "They won't work. We will only receive incorrect data." He looked away, then looked back at me, and looked away again, as if he knew something he wasn't ready to share. I didn't want to add to his stress, so I changed the subject. "I'm starting to get really worried," I said. His face turned towards me, thinking we were still discussing the mission. I waved my hand, making it clear that this was not about that. "I'm talking about my husband," I explained. "A certain picture is forming in my head, and I'm beginning to think that he is at least partially to blame for our delay." This seemed to interest him enough to sit next to me. "What do you mean guilty?" he asked. "I don't know for sure," I admitted. His behavior was completely different before I left. It was so unlike him. I then told Ron that I thought maybe Dan had something to do with my itching and hives. "He's a chemist," I added, "and a damn good one. I can see the doubt in your eyes, but he could build a pretty big bomb from what he found in your kitchen and garage." "This is madness," he objected. "If he knew about us, wouldn't he have just confronted you before you left?" I didn't want to say, but he's suspicious. He asked me directly if I slept with you and others during our travels, but I did not answer. He kept insisting because I was ignoring him something we promised each other we would never do, I replied. He has changed. If I didn't know him better, I would have thought that he might be having an affair. "You don't know better," he reminded me. "He doesn't know anything about us. He's just guessing." Chemist or not, I don't think he's capable of such intrigue. We both fell silent for a few minutes, lost in our thoughts. "Ron," I asked, "why are we installing sensors tomorrow if we both know they won't work?" Ron looked at me as if he had something to say that shouldn't be shared between us. "We already have all the data," he said quietly. "We have everything we need." "How?" "This is impossible," I said in confusion. "Then why this rise? What are you hiding from me?" "You don't need to know this." His gaze was sad. "You have to promise that you will never tell anyone about this, not even those closest to you, especially Dan. Can you make that promise?" I nodded in shock. Ron repeated his question twice more to make sure I understood. "Marley," he began, "we have all the data and information we need. What we don't have is time, and this is what we are sorely lacking. The new UK Parliament and the new Republican-led Congress are about to begin hearings on the credibility of climate science. The last thing we need right now is a loss of public support. We are already losing this battle." "But I helped develop these sensors," I said stupidly. "The only information we can gather below 8,000 feet will be inaccurate. We may not be able to collect and analyze data to draw valid conclusions." Ron touched my cheek softly. "Dear Marley," he sounded sincere, "now we are not talking about science. Forget about it and listen to me. There is an existential threat." "I know," I interrupted him. "Marley." Ron grabbed me by the shoulders. He looked more serious than he ever had in the entire time I knew him. I looked at him, overcome with horror. He waited for me to calm down. "Science," he continued, "the work we do is very important, but it is not the final goal. What we are doing will not produce results for at least another 10 years, and that is only if we do everything right. The immediate threat is not the climate, but 9 billion people." "I don't understand," I admitted. "Try to understand, Marley," he encouraged me. 9 billion people, each producing an average of 0.74 kilograms of garbage per day. That's almost 18 billion pounds of trash every day. In the US, people produce 5 pounds a day, not 1.6. It's not sustainable. We need climate data and figures now, even if they are controversial, so that world leaders can curb humanity's wasteful habits before it is too late. Although it may be too late. I was shocked. I just looked at him, expecting some stupid joke. I can't accept this, I said in a daze. Are you saying that's science? What? Fake? Oh, she's real, Ron chuckled, noticing my confusion. You studied at the university. You completed your degree and performed brilliantly. Remember when I checked your record before I hired you? 60, maybe 70% of what was in your textbooks was applicable, provable science. The rest was filtered through theoretical concepts and presented as logical conclusions. A hypothesis and then a thesis, sometimes without the key elements of specificity, clarity, and testability. Disease and war, he continued, used to be the planet's best defense in regulating population. But technology has changed that in both areas. In 3 weeks, I will appear before the British Parliament with our findings, very frightening findings. Of course, some will challenge them, but they will be presented in such a way that they look convincing. After that, I will go to South Africa, then to Greece. I have already been informed that I will be testifying before Congress next month. How could Brinks know about this? Ah, he said, standing up. The last thing you shouldn't know. Are you sure you want to hear this? If I tell you, you will become part of the inner circle forever. It was too much, but I couldn't let him stop there. I nodded slowly. Brinks knows, he said, because our partner, Blackstone, knows. They own a majority stake in Brinks, like most Fortune 100 companies, not to mention their close ties to the U.S. government. He chuckled and reached for a bottle of water. Your own husband works for us, although he has no idea about it. He handed me the water, and I was grateful because my mouth was as dry as the Sahara Desert. And that brings us back to the beginning of the conversation. He smiled for the first time. If your suspicions are true, you need to go home and convince him that nothing happened between us, that this never happened. Dispel his suspicions. Sleep with him if necessary, do whatever it takes. He can't have any proof unless he saw your phone. He doesn't know the code for my phone, I replied. Then he has only guesses, he objected. Remind him that he is a scientist and how far speculation will take him. You've told me more than once that you love him, so you love him with all your might. Behave as befits a loving wife. I wanted to tell Ron that this might have worked before, but I didn't say anything. The next morning, 2 other expedition members and I installed sensors on a flatter section of rock, partially protected from harsh weather conditions by a jagged cliff. The GPS showed us at 17,890 feet, which was far from our goal for collecting meaningful data. As we broke camp and began our descent from the mountain, I carefully watched Ron, who he talked to most often and who else was part of his inner circle. Upon my return, I had to do some serious digging and carefully question some long-time employees' Brinks. The man I was having an affair with was not at all who he said he was, at least for me. And then it dawned on me Dan was right all along. Dan, I'm ashamed to admit, but during those 6 weeks, I almost completely forgot about my wife, except to gloat from time to time, knowing that a couple of my plans had delayed them on the mountain. The rocket boosters, or rather the complex equations with which we calculated sufficient thrust for the payload, did not converge. My team worked tirelessly. As a leader, I called Washington and explained our dilemma. I said that to balance the payload and maintain stability, we need 14 boosters, not 15. Otherwise, there would be an oscillation that could cause the payload to tip over. An even or odd number did not matter. Any geometric scheme of 15 accelerators led to a structural failure. We needed to reduce the payload by 1,215 pounds in order for the 14 boosters to operate efficiently. Hot debate in teams, the conference went as I expected. Nobody wanted to give in. I asked that 2 of NASA's top materials engineers be sent to immediately test lighter materials for the payload. At least I got this small concession. Despite our overwhelming workload, Ginny and I tried to have dinner together at least once a week. A few days before my wife was expected to return, our dinner took a more serious turn. I have more news about Brinks, Ginny said as she finished her dessert. And you won't like them. She explained what she had learned. It sounded absurd. As she spoke, I couldn't imagine believing her. This is too much, I objected, even for the dark internet. That's the thing, Dan, she replied. These are people I know. I went to Cornell with one of them. He had a doctorate in anthropology, until he learned to keep his mouth shut. He constantly entered chat rooms and forums where he spoke about climate science. His arguments were convincing, and he now works as a bank teller. Jesus, Gene, I said in disbelief. Are you saying that he was silenced? Brinks? Look, I have a lot of problems with the dubious science they publish in journals, but now you sound like a conspiracy theorist. How reliable can the sites you visit be? Ginny looked at me as if I had two heads. About 1,000% more reliable than Fox News or CNN. Jesus, Dan, have you been living under a rock this whole time? Come on, I raised my voice a little more than I should have. You know that I was busy with my career. I'm not interested in politics or corporations. I only voted once in college, and that was because people at the polling place pestered me like barkers at an amusement park. Okay, she snapped. Then listen, since you don't know. Brink's cooperating with the Ministry of Defense is one thing, but what they plan to build is something else entirely. Our accelerators are being developed to propel their project into orbit. I didn't sign up for this. The initiative they are working on is Poe. Although I haven't figured out what that means yet, it has something to do with our boosters and my fuel. I began to see a different side to Ginny. She was perceptive, perhaps too perceptive. She helped me figure out the puzzle of my marriage when I trusted her with my doubts. Now she was investigating the company Marley worked for and trying to connect them to us. I couldn't understand why she was so obsessed with finding the gun that smokes in the hand. I was proud of the project we were working on, proud of myself as a team leader and the money it brought in. My wife was a separate problem. She cheated, and as soon as I get proof or she confesses, she will be out of my life. If my plan to get her up the mountain works, I'll know much sooner. 4 days later, returning home a little after 6, I was overwhelmed by the smell of my favorite dish. Marley ran out of the kitchen, jumping on me and wrapping her legs around my waist. "Oh God, honey," she screamed with joy. "Are you home? I missed you so much." "Well, of course," I answered dryly, ignoring her physical proximity. "Who did the cat drag?" Marley's legs and arms quickly left the space they occupied. Her smile turned into a disappointed grimace as she took a few steps back, trying to read me. I tried my best to remain calm and not show my emotions. "Aren't you glad to see me?" she asked, making one of her signature pouty faces. "Of course," I said, allowing a smile to appear on my face. "Just because you belong to someone else doesn't mean I wish you harm. Let me change, and you can tell me about all your adventures over dinner. I can smell it. You did your best preparing this." As I started to walk away, my words must have hit home. "Dan," she shouted, "what the hell do you mean belongs to someone else?" "We'll talk about this at dinner," I replied and left her standing there. 20 minutes later, we were sitting at a table with roast potatoes and carrots on it. I definitely poured the wine, waited for her to taste the food, then looked suspiciously at my plate and began to eat. I knew it was petty, but it would probably also answer at least one of her questions. There's no point in delaying it. Her first reaction was not what I expected. "Why did you do this to me?" she asked with a hint of anger in her voice. "And by the way, what did you do to me?" "I have no idea what you're talking about," I replied, continuing to chew. She glared at me before picking up the knife. "Where is that special underwear?" I asked. She froze before finishing cutting the meat. "Did you leave it with him, or did you plan to wear it for me tonight?" She placed the cutlery next to the plate. "So you checked my phone," she said affirmatively. I ignored her again. "Oh, look, Dan," I mimicked her. "I bought this sexy lingerie specifically so that we could rekindle the fire in our relationship after I had a lot of fun with my Portuguese stallion." She didn't look away, which was a good sign. The challenge meant that she had feelings for him, and my exposure would only hasten her departure from my life. "It's in my dresser, smart guy," she grumbled, her face flushing red. "No, I didn't mean to put it on for you. What happened between us? So he could see you posing in it here in our marital bedroom while I was at work," I interrupted her, not wanting to listen to her pathetic excuses. "You are simply amazing, Marley. Glad I found out about this now and not later. So what did you do, eh, Mr. Chemist?" She went on the attack, understanding why I interrupted her. "Did you add something to my cream or lotion? Sleeping bags were part of our equipment. What exactly did you use? Because of you, I couldn't complete my experiment. Are you satisfied?" "Again, I have no idea what you're talking about," I smiled with a devilish smile. "In any case, we are getting a divorce." "Oh no, we're not getting a divorce," she screamed. "When I find out what you did to me, I will find a way to forgive you. In a way, I deserved it. I did something bad too. I don't like him. We were just alone in the damn wilderness in the cold for several months. It was a simple biological need for both of us." I put down my fork and knife, after which he laughed, or rather burst out laughing, and threw the glass of wine at the opposite wall. She shuddered in her chair. "Please," I said mockingly, "don't insult me by pulling out hackneyed excuses from a cheater's guide. You seem to have forgotten. I saw your messages. It was a planned betrayal. You've had sex in Antarctica, and you've both been looking forward to having it again in the mountains. I'm sure it happened long before your trip. Undoubtedly, you plan to continue your dirty business now. We're dead." "Okay," she said arrogantly, "you are not ready to listen to me. I understand, but there will be no divorce. We will work this out like two loving adults. You offended me too, Dan, both with your last action and with your attitude towards my work over the past year. I'll stay here for a while," I sighed. "I'm busy with an important project and can't afford to be distracted by moving." I settled into the guest room. "And Marley, I will never be ready to hear what you have to say. If you loved me even a little, you would have already filled out the divorce papers online. Half and half is all it comes down to. And I don't give a damn about your creepy climate fantasy. Return to Salsa. Considering what you did to get him and get rid of me, he is now your man." I got up and left, leaving her sitting at the table. Later, I headed to a local cafe to work on complex equations in silence. I wanted to call Ginny and tell her how it went, but decided to put it off until the next day. When I returned home, Marley was already asleep. The next morning, Ginny caught me just before the meeting with the guys from NASA and pulled me aside. "Poe," she whispered, looking around. "This means production of orbital housing. These bastards are secretly carrying out the Soylent Green scenario, and they're using us to pull it off." "Are you sure, Jean?" I asked sternly. My life had already begun to seem like an emotionless emptiness. Cheating on his wife was one thing, but participating in the shady dealings of the corporation and government was much more depressing. "Don't you believe me?" Ginny caught my mood. "Damn, Dan, I wouldn't lie to you." She continued to stare at me. "Just forget it. I won't talk about this anymore." Ginny turned and walked away, disappointed and depressed. I pulled myself together. Family problems, women problems, but I still had work to do. I'll decide what I want for myself once we get through these boosters. I spent the day getting used to the two engineers. When I got home, Marley wanted to talk, so I let her. I tried to listen and pay attention, but my mind was racing with equations and possible scenarios. Besides, I was already done with Marley. I'm not one to cry over spilled milk or make a show. She changed. I realized this even before we found out about the pregnancy. And once this project goes according to plan, I will find a place to live, move my belongings, and submit documents. Dan, she brought me back to reality. Are you even listening to me? I'm trying to explain how this happened. "I'm sure I understand perfectly well, Mar," I said sarcastically. "I studied biology enough, as did you." "Not how, damn it." She was irritated by my indifference. "I'm trying to explain why." "Well, that's great," I said honestly. "I'm not interested in this. You have made your choice. You know why, or at least you should know. Your decisions didn't include me, so there's no point in telling me now. The time to talk was when I first made my accusations against you. God, what a bastard you are, she screamed. What happened to you? Where is the Dan Dawson I fell in love with? Ask Sousa, I said, leaving the room. He can explain it to you. There were no more conversations that night, nor the next day. I had enough to do with the engineers. They have already significantly reduced the weight of our payload. Ginny seemed to purposely avoid interacting with me. This was done deliberately. The next morning, Marley got up early and made coffee. She looked like she wanted to talk again. While she was making me scrambled eggs, she made a gagging sound, dropped the spatula, and ran to the bathroom. I heard her vomit. She stayed there for a long time. I left for work. When I returned late at night, her behavior had completely changed. The protective and sarcastic mask was replaced by calm and caring. She didn't try to touch me, but she was chattier than usual. I wondered what her plan was. The next day, around noon, I called an unscheduled team meeting to update the cargo weight. Ginny didn't show up, and when I asked, the other team members said they hadn't seen her. I called her cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Late in the evening, when I returned home, I saw a light in our living room. We rarely spent time in this room. There was a black sedan parked in front of the house. Entering the house, I set down my case, walked past the living room, and headed to the refrigerator and took out a beer. Marley stood in the doorway, silent. She knew what I was thinking. I walked past her and headed into the living room. Marley, I said as she followed, what is this Portuguese bastard doing in my house? I sat down in the chair opposite my enemy, assessing the huge man in a tight suit standing next to Salsa. He was hard to miss, and he looked down at me without even moving his head. I don't remember that we invited him, I said, finally looking at her. Well, whatever it is, let's get it over with. I'm busy. Daniel, Salsa said with a slowly appearing smile, you are quite a resourceful person. A good scientist, as far as I have heard and seen. He paused, looking at Marley. She avoided my gaze. I owe you an apology, he continued. You have every right to be angry, and I understand your hostility towards Marley, but I assure you that all of this is more than my fault. She loves you, very much. Being on an ice shelf is very lonely, and yes, I stalked her in a closed environment. I'm sure you understand. I took a long sip of beer. The smug bastard was so condescending that he was lucky to have this big guy standing next to him. I see, I told him. Can I assume that you also slept with other members of the Antarctic team? Maybe it was so lonely there that everyone slept with each other? One big, lonely sex party, huh? I can certainly understand that. But that doesn't change the fact that you're a worthless piece of crap and she's a prostitute. Tell me, was there the same loneliness at Manaslu? The smile disappeared from his face, replaced by an expression of absolute confidence. It was clear that he did not want to be in my house and argue with a person he did not respect. Okay, he changed tactics. Now that the pleasantries are out of the way, let's talk about grief and the future, okay? He gave my wife a significant look. They clearly rehearsed this. So, he began, you found our messages. That was rude, by the way. Anyway, fuck you, I said, leaning forward. Let's get to the point. Of course, he said. You took advantage of what you knew, a little revenge. Some kind of modified talc, I assume. Itch powder, I replied. Ah, simple and effective, he chuckled. Very chemically. And judging by what Marley said, she is only allergic to one type of drug. Sulfur derivative? In lotion? I shrugged slightly. Bravo, Daniel, he laughed loudly. I raised my beer like toast. Marley, be a good wife and mistress. Please fill Daniel's glass. Me too, if you don't mind, Daniel. I didn't answer, so he continued. Now we come to the unintended consequences of your actions. Don't get me wrong, I actually like that you didn't sit back and let yourself be my cuckold. Unfortunately for all of us, the kind doctor played it safe and gave your wife 3 doses of grisafulvin. This is your area of expertise, Daniel. Can you tell us how this drug affects, say, contraceptives? Benadryl was probably too much. I understood why my wife felt bad. For me, this was the icing on the cake. Wonderful. I started, placing the bottle on the coffee table. So I did you two love doves a favor. Wonderful. Congratulations, Padre. I believe you will take the expectant mother from my arms as soon as possible. Ronaldo's expression changed instantly. He turned to his thug and said, "Do it." The big guy grabbed the gun from his holster before I could even think of anything and pointed it at me. My whole life flashed before my eyes. Later, I realized that Marley was not part of this series of memories. Then I felt unbearable pain. But it wasn't breasts. It was the inside of my left thigh where the indescribable pain was coming from. I looked down but saw no blood or wound. My screams filled the room. I looked around, and when my wife saw me, she dropped the beer bottles. When I stopped moaning so loudly, Sousa broke the silence. I bet it hurts. He was no longer laughing, and his gaze was intense and serious. I don't need your wife. What happened between us meant something, but not what you imagined. Now it's time to stand up and be a man. Take responsibility for your little trick. You will honor your vows, for better or for worse, as they say. She is going on maternity leave starting today. She will be here, playing the part of a loving and devoted wife, helping to save you from all your problems. You will complete the project you were assigned to lead, he continued. After all, you are the best person for this task. No more distractions or resentments at home. And that sweet girl at the base with whom you had dinner alone. She was transferred today. She seemed to have some questionable internet habits. I was still rubbing my leg where the rubber bullet hit. The tumor was already growing. The pain would torment me for several days. But most importantly, Sousa was not joking. I was in trouble, and if I wasn't mistaken, so was Marley and her unborn child. That's right, Daniel, he finished. Now that the duel is over and you understand me, I'm leaving. Take care of your wife and complete the task that the military has assigned to you. Do both as if your life depended on it, because that's how it is. If you make me even the slightest bit angry, it will be the end for you, Marley, and possibly your entire family. He nodded to his man, and they walked out the door, closing it softly behind them. Marley rushed towards me, trying to figure out what she could do for my leg, but I pushed her away. Get the hell away from me, I hissed. Don't touch me, damn you. Marley pulled back and sat on the edge of the sofa, as far away from me as possible. She watched silently as I rubbed the area around the wound. I felt like a wounded animal licking its wounds in the silence of the room, and I tried to get up. It hurt like hell. Can I at least take a look? She asked softly. I stood up again, forgetting about the pain. Have you not done enough in your life? In the bathroom, I locked the door and pulled down my pants. It looked as bad as it felt. A multicolored hematoma has already begun to form. I promised myself at that moment that somehow I would make Ronaldo pay for everything he had done. At the same time, I knew it wouldn't be easy because there was so much more behind it than just Sousa. There was a soft knock on the door. Dan, are you okay? Damn, she wasn't going to calm down. Perhaps she was trying to get me, or maybe she had already begun to get into character, as her lover promised. Either way, I knew we'd have to talk this evening. It was impossible to postpone for several reasons. Give me a minute, okay? I barked. Order some food or something like that. 20 minutes and half a tube of burn ointment later to numb the pain in my leg. I walked out to face the cause of all my misfortune. Marley was sitting at the kitchen table with a half-finished bottle of wine in front of her. She was looking out the window. Food will be here soon, she said without emotion. I took the beer and pulled out a bottle from the top shelf maker's mark. Marley's phone beeped, and she went to the door to get some Chinese food. We ate in silence. Sorry, she said, clearing the table. They were just words, devoid of meaning and sincerity. Since she started, I decided it was time to say what needed to be said. I'll sleep in the guest room, I announced. I'll finish this project and then retire from the Space Force. I don't care about your friend and his threats. Don't have any illusions about reconciliation, it won't happen. I don't know what's up with Brinks, but I'm guessing there are other dangerous people higher up the chain. So for now, we'll play by Salsa's rules until I figure out a way out, even if he's bluffing. What do you know about what he said? Or are you in on it too? She hesitated, but eventually sat back down and poured another glass of wine. I don't know anything, she said, besides what he told you. Something about your project is connected to a secret operation that Brinks and he are overseeing. She hesitated, and I realized that she had missed something. But then she abruptly changed the subject. Were you trying to get him to impregnate me? She looked me straight in the eyes. Why did you do all this without even talking to me? Because, I answered honestly, as soon as I found out that you were sleeping with him, everything was over between us. I was furious and decided to get a little revenge, especially since you refused to explain yourself when I asked you several times. I didn't think about drugs interfering with your contraception. But on the other hand, when this circus is over and I disappear, you and he will be able to raise your child and live happily ever after. Yeah, she snorted, but I don't want this. I never wanted to. I just felt lonely, and he was nearby. I'm sure I satisfied his needs, just as he satisfied mine. It was purely biological. Marley, keep convincing yourself of this. I have long imagined what excuses she would find for herself. I wanted children from you, she said with feeling. Whether you believe it or not. It's too late, dear wife. It doesn't matter what I believe. Let's just try to be civil until we get out of this mess, okay? The next morning, I had a lot to do. While Marley slept, I packed up my laptop and pulled out the surveillance equipment from behind the knickknacks on the shelves in our living room. I went straight to my office at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory because if I was being followed, I had to behave as naturally as possible. Stopping at a coffee shop that I don't usually go to might arouse suspicion. There, I turned off the Wi-Fi and turned on Bluetooth, downloading the surveillance footage from the previous day in our living room into a secure account that only Ginny and I had access to. Then I turned off Bluetooth and deleted all the files that had accumulated during this connection. Later, my colleagues openly discussed Ginny's disappearance. She was not just an integral part of the team, she was the only one who could solve our problems with inter-system interaction if they suddenly arose. Her protege frantically went through the formulas as if this could fix something. That night and the next, the atmosphere in the house was icy. It was difficult to get used to the new reality. Marley and I always knew how to spend time together, even when we didn't see eye to eye. Now it has become unbearable. The next day, I went through my checklist. From my phone, I transferred the rest of our money to a new account I recently opened. At lunchtime, I went to the bank and transferred funds to an offshore account that I had prepared in advance. This money won't be immediately available if I have to flee, because the government will probably be able to track it. When I returned to work, I replaced the erroneous formulas that Ginny had provided with the correct ones. The changes were so minor that no one on the team should have noticed them, or so I hoped. On the way home, I realized that my getaway car was still parked in the parking lot of the Flintridge Riding Club, 4 blocks from our house. At home, I tried my best to treat my wife, my future ex-wife, as a person. We had dinner together, and I even asked her about her project in the mountains. Marley even caught herself smiling several times during the conversation. When she went to bed, I took out the necessary things from the safe, including our passports. A storm is coming. I could barely sleep, replaying every step in my head to avoid making a fatal mistake. At 10 in the morning, sitting in my office, I felt the burner phone vibrate in my pocket for the first time since I received it. As expected, it was Ginny. "I'm there," she said. "I got it," I replied and hung up. After the call, I left JPL, parked my car at the dumpster outside the riding club, and hit the road toward the mountains. I had plenty of time to think about it as I drove through Grapevine Pass. My new car, a 1972 Monte Carlo, was completely untraceable. I found the address of the cabin without the help of gadgets. They disappeared at 2 gas stations where I stopped on the way along the I-5 highway. The house was secludedly hidden away from the road. Anyone who was inside would have seen me before I noticed them. I almost turned around, overcome with anxiety. Ginny hugged me when she opened the door. She was tense to the limit. When I entered the living room, Marley was sitting on the sofa. "What is she doing here?" I exclaimed. "Are you crazy? She is our enemy. She's with him." "Calm down, Dan," she said softly. "She's not with him. She's here to help, mostly for myself, but for us too. She has important information. It's better for her to be with us than against us. Besides, I don't want to see her dead." I silently looked into Marley's face without saying hello. Both women were tense. "Sit down, Dan," Ginny told me. "Beer or coffee?" I chose coffee. "What's going on, Gin?" I asked with concern. "I was in a panic when you were transferred." "Me too," she admitted. "I immediately called my father. My parents are wealthy people. He told me to find a safe place immediately. I told him about our burner phones, and he began to formulate a plan." She continued. "He told me to be at Union Station at 9 o'clock the next morning. He told me where to sit, how to dress, and then at 9:14 sharp to go to Starbucks and get in line. As I did this, someone in a hurry bumped into me. I placed my order, picked up my drink, and headed out to the parking lot. There was a phone in my jacket pocket. The message contained an address and instructions to arrive here as soon as possible. Then I realized that we were all in danger. After what you told me about the visit to Ronaldo, I suspected that your wife was also deeply involved in this." "This is great," I admitted, hesitantly. "But you and I had a plan, or at least the beginnings of it. And now you changed that plan without even telling me. Even after Sousa told me that you were removed from the project, I still believed that you would not violate our agreement. And this is it." I waved my hand towards my wife. Marley looked at me sadly. I saw emotions bubbling just below the surface. "I'm not here to ruin everything," she promised. "I understand that everything is over between us, but now I have a child that I have to take care of, and I would like to keep both of us alive. If I can help you, despite what I've done, that will be a bonus." I had no reason to believe her. In a few days, all hell would break loose, and such a hellfire would put Ginny and me on the worst possible list. Marley. After the awkward last night, I was excited for a new day. The obvious sitting in the same room as my soon-to-be ex-husband and trying to talk to his supposed new woman proved almost unbearable. I saw right through her, a cunning, beautiful bitch. We spent most of the time discussing plans for the next few days and what I would need to do my part. After a hearty breakfast, which I was completely unaccustomed to, we hit the road. We were driving an old Mustang convertible, as Jean had explained the night before, a car that couldn't be traced because it was purely manual and no electronics. We headed through the mountains on Highway 33 through Ajay to Ventura Harbor, where Jean or her father had organized a charter without any entry on the manifest. Jean wouldn't tell me where the ship was going, and she promised she wouldn't tell me until we were far out to sea. While Dan drove, Jean interrogated me about what I knew about Ron and the Brinks. It was unpleasant and awkward to discuss this in front of Dan, and he also seemed to still be angry with Jean for letting me go with them. I talked about my work and what connected me with Ron, with the exception of our last conversation in the mountains. Strangely, I no longer saw Dan as my husband. The fact is that I began to realize that we had been emotionally distant for a long time. It probably started when I got the job at Brinks, and it had nothing to do with Ron at the time. I believed in my work, in my science. That is why I chose this specialty. But there was more to it than that. The more I delved into my work at Brinks, the clearer my future became. As an author who dreams of writing a great book, I could imagine how our research would lead me to a discovery that could save the Earth from impending disaster. I saw myself on the pages of scientific articles and in history textbooks. I remembered one terrible week a few years ago. Over dinner, I talked about the new technology we were testing for atmospheric temperature monitoring. Perhaps Dan was having a bad day, but he suddenly started laughing loudly, and this laugh was directed at me. He dared to ask me, What was the temperature in Chicago on April 1st, 1863? Instead of answering, I glared at him, so he continued, what about Baltimore on any day in November 1919? I tried to calm down, saying that I understood what he was getting at and asked him to stop. He just grinned and went back to eating, and after a few minutes he paused, grabbed the phone, and started working on it. Tell me, Marley, he said in his smug voice, what is the temperature now? Just wondering what your weather app shows. Could you tell me? This was the end of my patience. I took my phone. 84, smart guy, I told him. He grinned and turned his phone screen towards me. Funny thing, the grin became wider. It shows 83, and half an hour ago, there were 82 in the car. I didn't look at the board at the bank, but I'm sure it says something else. These are the kinds of arguments we had. He argued that thermometers were not accurate for the first 50 years of their existence, so science had little data for comparison, and the fact that they were still inaccurate proved that global warming was impossible to predict or prove. I pointed out that the problem was not in the thermometers themselves, but in the places where the temperature was measured. After that argument, we slept separately for 6 nights and were not intimate for another week. If there was one thing Dan and Ronaldo agreed on, it was that the planet was seriously overpopulated. Dan always said that if we want to save the Earth, we need to fix the soil. Stop spraying chemicals at ground level and even higher in the clouds. The ability of soil to sequester carbon is a natural function of the planet. When I tried to doubt his theory, even mildly, he immediately pointed out all the climate crisis predictions that never came true. In contrast, Ron was a recognized authority in this field. He saw our work as an undeniable need concrete answers that would put an end to people's endless debate on this issue. When he needed his team to dig deep and overcome fatigue, he reminded us that more than 75% of the population still didn't believe a word we said. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Dan and I were not compatible and probably never would be. Yes, make-up sex was often a highlight, but the truth was that every time we argued about our life's work, we lost a little more respect for each other. Once we reached the Ventura city limits, we turned onto the side streets and soon parked at one of the small marinas in the harbor. The captain was a stocky man with a thick Australian accent. His assistant, a young surfer guy, helped load our modest luggage on board. Jean bought several new sets of clothes and toiletries for my husband. I had to get used to the idea that he was no longer my husband, and I had to do it quickly. We quickly went out into the open sea, and I stood on the bow, lost in daydreams, watching the dolphins jump out of the water from time to time. Absorbed in my thoughts, I did not notice what the other 4 people on board were doing. My life has changed completely, and not for the better. By association, I was now marked, but worse than that, I had to become a mother, a single mother, and I had no idea whether Dan and Jean would help me or abandon me once we got to our destination. Suddenly, I felt a strong urge to talk to family or friends, it didn't matter who. Anyone who cared about me would do, maybe even Ron, although I knew that wouldn't be the best idea. Jean came up to me and asked if I was hungry. I just nodded, and she soon returned with a tuna sandwich. I know it's hard, she tried to sound sympathetic. It's hard for all of us. Tomorrow morning, we will explain what is about to happen, and our plan is to lie low for as long as necessary. As long as it takes, she said. Not only Ron and his confidants will be looking for us, but also the Ministry of Defense and the military. Later, waking up after a short sleep, I looked at the bow of the ship pointing to the setting sun and thought about what awaits all life below me when people make these waters uninhabitable. Dan. Breakfast passed in a calm atmosphere. Marley hasn't spoken much since we left the harbor. She did not join us for dinner last night and went to her cabin early. Before we sat down at the table, Jean and I discussed her state of mind and decided to be careful about how much information we gave her. Marley, we're heading to Hawaii, I began, taking a deep breath. From there, we will go to Polynesia, to one of the islands where both locals and whites live. We can get lost there. If necessary, we will be able to move to other nearby islands. Fool, Marley spat. Do you think you can hide from people with endless resources and money? You signed your own death warrant, and me too. Why did you do this? She asked dejectedly. Why couldn't you leave everything as it is? Why did you destroy everything? She looked out to sea without turning her head in our direction. I didn't destroy anything, Marley. I had no choice. It wasn't me who started it all, it was you. You could have told me that you wanted to be with him. I would accept it and let you go, even bless you. We've been off course for a long time. But you weren't honest, and none of us could have predicted what we'd find out about Brinks and the Dodd guys. And what do you think you learned? She asked. We can't tell you everything, I replied. At least not yet. I can only say that everything will begin today, and it will last for a long time. This is done so that stories do not die in the media space. We will add information gradually so that Brinks always remains in the spotlight. Some will be true, some will be half-truths, and some will be pure speculation, but everything will be aimed at maximum effect. We lived in Save, in the Samon archipelago, for almost a year. The island offered us a certain freedom of action. As one of the most westerly in the chain, it allowed us to quickly escape to other islands in Melanesia, where different laws applied. Life wasn't easy for the three of us at first. Despite the fact that 7% of the population were Anglo-Saxons, the locals treated us with deep mistrust. If it weren't for the religious family who took us in a few weeks after we arrived, I'm not sure we would have survived. Despite my dislike of Marley, I couldn't bear to see my ex-wife, now pregnant, suffer from malnutrition. I got a job on the docks in the main city. Jean found a job at a local energy company. Marley was the latest to take a day shift job as a cashier at a local grocery store. We laid low for the first 6 months, living in a small apartment. Any news from the outside world came through newspapers from Australia and New Zealand. They painted a grim picture for Sousa and, by extension, Brinks. Ronaldo fell first. With the data provided by Marley and our improvisation of the facts, the evidence was sent to all major news outlets. Then the security camera footage from my house came out. Sousa was arrested, and then the FBI got involved. His lie detector helped him get bail, but he remained under house arrest awaiting trial. Brinks disowned him almost immediately, but new information we leaked revealed their involvement. Jeannie tweaked the computer's fuel formulas enough to cause the launch to fail with a loud crash. As a result, the launch was canceled pending an investigation by Congress and NASA. Informants came to the rescue, revealing plans for what they were going to do in space. Ronaldo Sousa is stuck in New York and will likely never face trial for our disappearance, but his career is tarnished and over. 4 weeks after we left, the latest leak was information that Jeannie received from the dark web. This was a weak point regarding the orbital truss, but quite suspicious given the reputation of such a famous scientist as Jeannie, especially after her disappearance. Sometimes sowing the seeds of a conspiracy is as easy as telling the truth. On the home front, a tense front, with unusual allies, Marley was tired of listening to Jeannie and I argue late at night. The walls were too thin. She moved in with a colleague the day she received her second paycheck. This didn't mean we stopped spending time together. My ex-wife got used to Jeannie. We all followed an unspoken rule. Marley and I were no longer together, and we might never be able to get a divorce. We had dinner together when we had free evenings. Jeannie and I helped Marley with her pregnancy in any way we could. All the revenge I planned and carried out was realized at the very beginning, so I had already gone through all the stages of grief. In addition, Marley was restrained, realizing that it was because of her that we became outcasts. I didn't want the child to have my last name, although Marley tried to persuade me. We also rejected my middle name, Edward. She settled on the name Bradley Morris. From the first day, I decided to call him Philip, something like a comic allusion to the brand of cigarettes. For our safety and the safety of all Jeannie's parents involved, the plan was to wait 2 years before telling Marley's and mine that we were alive and well. Philip was a few months old, and we had been on the island for almost a year when this happened. Marley went on dates with locals who either worked at the market or were regular customers. None of this seemed serious. I wasn't sure how to feel about it. I had to remind myself that the last few years with her had not been the best. Meanwhile, Jeannie and I's relationship grew from friendship into something more. Living on the run may have contributed to our feelings, but I knew we weren't in love yet. I hoped it would happen naturally because I really cared about her. Marley was sitting in a local seafood cafe in an area that most Americans would consider downtown. She was with one of her boyfriends, and Jeannie and I were sitting on the other side of the restaurant. We were not on the pier itself, but only 1 block away. The smell of the ocean always whets my appetite for local delicacies. When we were served a pot of seafood, something in the periphery of my vision seemed strange to me. I froze, but almost immediately went into defense mode. Until that moment, I, of course, understood that I cared about Marley as a person, but I did not realize what exactly she meant to me. I looked at Jeannie, and she immediately knew something was wrong. She looked around, scanning the room. I looked at Marley, but she was too busy with her companion to notice anything. "Go to Marley," Jeannie said. "I'll try to distract them." "No," I whispered sharply. "It's too risky. Let's act together. Wait." I got an idea. I took out my phone and dialed Marley's number. She heard, fortunately, and looked at me strangely across the restaurant. I made a sharp nod towards the exit. She didn't understand at first, but soon the realization showed on her face. She said something to her companion, Paulo, and they quickly stood up and headed towards the back exit. To distract attention from their departure, I threw one of the crab claws into the opposite corner of the room. This gave Marley and Paulo enough time, but it did not save us. The claw hit the old man's head, and a commotion ensued. Jeannie and I are stuck. We had to choose one of the other exits, the back one, or the terrace where those people weren't. The closest exit was directly behind me, not exactly opposite the men, but probably our best chance. I motioned for Jeannie to get down on the floor. We started crawling, using our table and another one as cover. I almost breathed a sigh of relief when I heard a woman squeal and the creak of chairs on the concrete floor. We were noticed. "Let's run," I ordered Jeannie. We didn't have much of a lead, and I started to panic. We didn't know how many there were. We ran to the left, went around the restaurant, and headed into the alley behind the shops. I noticed one of the small restroom booths that were used to keep the market clean. The door was ajar. I pulled Jeannie inside and carefully closed the door. There was no security in this room. Inside there were 2 carts with buckets and mops, several brooms, and opposite the door there was a rack with cleaning products. We squatted in front of the rack. It was quiet outside for a few minutes. I began to calm down, but not enough to go out. After about 10 minutes, which seemed like an eternity, we heard voices. "We need to check each of these rooms," said a male voice. "Let's start from this end." A couple of minutes later, we faced our worst nightmare. We were unarmed, sitting on the floor. The man, shining a flashlight on us, touched the device in his ear. We found them. The other one couldn't go far. It's an unsettling feeling when a gun is pointed at you. This has already happened to me once, but it didn't make me any more used to it. They didn't say a word, and we were both afraid to make a sound, so we just sat there, waiting. Many thoughts flashed through my head. Why did I put us in this situation? Ginny was just as much to blame for this, but I could have just swallowed my pride, kept working, kept my papers and status, and then gotten another job. I could go home every night and ignore my deadbeat wife and kid. I could spend my nights in clubs, find women there, and just stall for time. Why was I so stupidly eager for revenge? Why did I think settling scores with people like Brinks, Blackstone, and the Department of Defense was smart? I thought about my family. They didn't know if I was alive or dead, so they remained safe and ignorant. They have already experienced the pain of loss. Finally, I thought about how Ginny and Marley could be killed. The door slowly opened. Ronaldo came in, holding Marley's hand tightly. He roughly pushed her to the floor between us and the thugs, and then focused his attention on me. "Did you really think you could get away with this?" His self-confident and mocking tone was familiar to me. "How stupid you are. But it doesn't matter. You tried to take my life and destroy my reputation, and now we will take yours. Let the women go, I tried to command, but I sounded unconvincing. Your business is with me. It was I who took pleasure in striking you. I organized everything. They will stay here and never leave this place. Your dirty secret will be safe with them. How noble he grinned. Suddenly, you started caring about Marley. And about her child, I reminded him. What happened next was so rapid that I still cannot remember, even after the stories of eyewitnesses. Flashes, sounds of gunfire, screams from at least one of the women. Something fell behind me. I heard someone say, "He's coming to his senses." A local islander in a white coat stood over me. "Zachary," he said, using the fake name I had been hiding under for almost a year. "Where are Anna and Paula?" I tried to sit up sharply. These were the names that Marley and Ginny were known by. "Hush, hush," he said, gently laying me back on the pillow. "Relax. They're fine. They are waiting outside. You have a pretty bad head injury." Ginny must have heard the noise because she burst into the room and ran to my bed. She grabbed my hand and squeezed it tightly. In that moment, I felt her love for me on a deeper level than ever before. She kissed my face passionately. "Marley?" I asked, and Ginny understood everything. "She's here," she answered. "I wanted to go in first. She should talk to you when I'm done. A shelf fell on you, and its contents hit you on the head. We were all very lucky that we weren't shot." The doctor explained a few things about what I would need to do after discharge. I had a concussion and was unconscious for about 20 minutes before they brought me to the clinic. After he left, Ginny leaned towards my ear. "Paulo and his comrade saved our lives," she said. "They shot those two from Brinks with harpoons. They still managed to shoot, which is why you were wounded." "What's with this bastard?" I couldn't help but ask. "It's a long story," she answered, "and Marley will tell it to you herself." Marley walked into the room with an expression on her face that I hadn't seen in a long time. Perhaps confidence described him best. She looked at me with love, but behind this look there was determination. "How are you feeling, Dan?" she asked softly. She already knew the answer, but I answered anyway. "And you?" I asked sincerely. "Better than ever, probably," she answered, sitting down next to me on the bed. I think she noticed my confusion. "I'm leaving the island tonight," she said. "From Paulo. For a while, until everything calms down." I tried to get up in a panic, but she gently put her hands on my shoulders. "Calm down, Dan," she reassured. "It's all settled, and no, I'm not being forced." "What happened to Sousa?" I asked. "He's dead." Marley tried to say it calmly, but I saw sadness in her eyes. "Shot," she continued. "One of the guys from Brinks. By accident, after he was pierced with a harpoon." "I don't know what to say," I answered honestly. "Where are they now? Is that why you're leaving?" "Yes," she looked out the window. "And all three are now at the bottom of the harbor." She chuckled slightly. "Look, I messed up. I know it, and I fully admit my guilt. You and I will no longer exist. I should have been honest with you, and for that I sincerely apologize. I'm sorry for the broken dreams and the pain I caused you. You didn't deserve it, and I was selfish. But we are both guilty of a lack of respect for each other, and it started long before Antarctica. Sex was inevitable. It was predictable because we were stuck in one place for several months, but that's only part of the story. I admired him. Constantly working together, he valued my point of view and increasingly relied on my suggestions and alternative solutions to confirm hypotheses. I became his right hand. I didn't love him and I didn't want his child, but those were the cards I was dealt. I don't blame you anymore. You and Ginny," she continued, "must leave the island within the next 3 days. They will send others here, and they will look for them." She fell silent, and we just looked at each other for several long minutes. "I'm sorry it hurt you." A tear rolled down her cheek. "Sorry for every damn little thing. We were made for each other in everything, except the most important thing, our personal beliefs. I hope you find what you're looking for with Ginny. She is beautiful and in love with you just as I was once in love." Her eyes were now filled with tears. I was overcome with emotion and may have become melancholy at that moment. I once again apologized to Marley for deliberately making her sick and pregnant. I even apologized for the constant ridicule of her profession. For the first time, I felt like a real ass for possibly pushing her into Sousa's arms. She leaned over, gave me a big hug and a kiss on the cheek, and then turned to leave. "What will you do?" I asked for no particular reason. "When Paulo and I return in 6 to 12 months, she said. "We'll get married. This morning he said he loves me and little Bradley. Someday I'll probably study volcanology at a local university. There is a lot of work in this area." Finally, I thought, a worthwhile and applied science. Opening the door, she turned to me. "Remember to recycle, even if I'm not around to remind you." She smiled her best smile and walked out for good. We arrived on the island of Eupola 4 days after I was discharged from the clinic. We gave the doctor and staff everything we had in our humble home just to keep our names off the records. Our goal was to get lost among the locals. Eupola was Samoa's largest and most diverse island. The villagers who participated in disposing of the bodies never gave us up, I think. I never officially divorced Marley. We couldn't. 2 years later, Ginny and I got married in a local wedding ceremony. First, I got a job, the sadness, or in local terms, pill maker, at your local pharmacy. I later worked on the docks to make ends meet when Ginny became pregnant with our first child. Pharmacy work brought in $100 per hour. When I started mixing chemicals on the docks to bait fish for the tourist boats, I started making even more money. It was a simple life, devoid of the stress and complex equations required to launch ships into space. Ginny and I enjoyed every moment, leisurely enjoying life with our children in an idyllic fairy tale world. From time to time, my instincts told me to be on guard, to look around for strangers who might be hunting us, but nothing like that ever happened again. Ginny sometimes teases me for not sorting beer bottles. She does this because she is tired of tourists and their habit of leaving trash on the beaches. Sometimes we take the bags and the children and go to the beach to pick up trash. She looks at me lovingly as we work. Science helped me in my life, but almost destroyed it. If the world ever goes to hell, we're probably in one of the best places to survive it. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.